of the Gra, and the same is true of the Chazon Ish. All the poskim I just mentioned, all the Chachamim I just mentioned, were independent in their Piskei Halacha, willing to differ with earlier authorities based on what they saw in the sources. Okay. The sources being the primary sources of Chazal and the secondary sources of the Rishonim. They were willing to express a Psak Halacha which was not necessarily what most other Rabbanim were expressing. Is that correct?
Correct.
Correct. In the same way, Machon Shilo follows in that derech, which is also the derech I could add more names, the Maharshal and the Rogatchover and the Netziv, and the list is very, very long indeed. To say, of course, that we follow truth is a statement which requires an explanation. What is truth? How do you discover truth? There is a derech of limud. There is a way of analyzing the texts that we have from Chazal with the aid of the Geonim and the Rishonim and the Achronim. Although the Geonim and the Rishonim, of course, have pride of place. And based on a rigorous and intellectually honest analysis of those sources, we can reach conclusions. Now, if you're asking me, if two positions are presented in the Talmud Bavli on a certain issue, and it's clear from the Talmud Bavli's sugya that the halacha is like A and not like B, even though it may seem to me personally that B should be the halacha, not A, and let's assume we're talking about a sugya when there is no sugya in the Yerushalmi. There's no Yerushalmi on this issue. I would not get up and say, off my own bat, the halacha should be like B, not like A. But if in the Talmud Yerushalmi you see, and you do very often see this, that the Shita which is rejected by the Talmud Bavli is actually accepted, or was the only Shita perhaps that appears in the Talmud Yerushalmi, that I believe is a different situation altogether. Why do I say that? Because I revert now to what I was trying to explain before. The essential reason that we listen to Chazal is because they are the Mekablim, they are those who receive the Torah, and they are the experts in Torah. In the same way, if a person wants to study classical music, you have to go to the people who've spent their lives delving into classical music and studying it and playing it and writing it and performing it, and they're the people who can tell you what classical music is all about. In the same way, you want to know what Torah is all about, you have to go to these people. They're Mekablei Torah. But those Mekablei Torah, those Chachamim, if we take at least the historical period that we generally refer to as Chazal, lived in Bavel and also lived in Eretz Yisrael. For what reason would one prefer the Talmud Bavli over the Talmud Yerushalmi? Logically. Particularly when we take into account the fact that Chazal tell us many times, in Torah k'Torat Eretz Yisrael. Rabbi Yirmiyah says in Masechet Shabbat that b'mahashakim hoshivani zeh Talmudah shel Bavel. That's a fairly strong statement, wouldn't you say? If I was to get up in any yeshiva today and say, this book that you're studying, the Talmud of Bavel, is full of darkness, they would stone me. Rabbi Yirmiyah, however, said, "B'mahashakim hoshivani," you have placed me in darkness. Zeh Talmudah shel Bavel. This refers to the Talmud Bavli. He's telling you that the Talmud Bavli is not perfect in every way, and there are many things that in the Talmud Bavli or in Bavel were misunderstood or not interpreted correctly, where in Eretz Yisrael they were interpreted correctly. The same appears in Masechet Pesachim Daf Lamed Bet, where he says that those who live in Bavel...
Batrai. It's Bathrai or Basra. In other words, you find that the Mefarshim say that the Talmud Bavli is more authoritative than the Talmud Yerushalmi because of the concept of them coming later.
Correct. Now, I just read to you before from the Rambam, and I read it again. The Rambam says we have a mahloket between different chachamim or different batei din, and the same would apply, I think, between different talmudim. The Rambam says, "En shom'im larishon ela lamisha hada'ath notali dvarau ben rishon ben aharon." The klal of halacha kebathra'eh is unknown to the Rambam. The Rosh also did not agree with this klal, except for a very specific number of generations amongst the Amoraim, as he writes Mefurash. Only in that particular time frame, do we apply the klal of halacha kebathra'eh, and even there perhaps there are exceptions as different. For instance, when there's a tamid and a rav and other issues. But as a rule, halacha is not like kebathra'eh, not according to the Rambam, not according to the Rosh, not according to many Rishonim, but according to what seems to be correct. What is written in the Rif, the end of Masechet Eruvin, that the halacha is like the Talmud Bavli because it's bathra'ah legabei in reference to the Yerushalmi, that I believe is excuse rather than the real reason. I don't believe that's the reason why the nitiyah, why the leaning of many Chachamim, of most of the Rishonim, and certainly Gonei Bavel, for obvious, it almost goes without saying, was to accept the authority of the Talmud Bavli. We have to understand that there was always, historically, as soon as the Olam HaTorah began to increase in size and in learning in Bavel, in other words, roughly from the time of Rav and Shmuel onwards, there was always tension between Bavel and Eretz Yisrael. And for a very long time, even when there was lots of learning in Eretz Yisrael, in Bavel, they still considered Eretz Yisrael to be the greater source of authority. You find places in the Talmud Bavli where Rabbi says to someone, "Oh, you're going to Eretz Yisrael, I want you, when you're there, to ask this question because they know better than we do," for example. Right? Or it says in the Talmud Bavli, "Anan kaifenan loho." We have to follow them because they even cover the Chodesh, the Luach for us. But as time went on, for historical reasons, not halachic reasons, not reasons of lamdanuth or intellectual reasoning, but rather for historical reasons, the center of learning in Bavel continued to increase, and in Bavel the Jews, generally speaking, lived in a calm and peaceful environment. They were not persecuted as most of the time. Whereas in Eretz Yisrael, as time went on, things went from bad to worse, particularly when the Roman Empire, which then became known as the Byzantines, became very frum Christians, so to speak. Then they had a real axe to grind with the Jews, and the yeshivot, and in general the Jewish presence in Eretz Yisrael was persecuted, and increasingly Jews left Eretz Yisrael, and the yeshivot were increasingly closed down. So over a period of time, whereas initially there was a certain, first Eretz Yisrael was superior to Bavel, then Eretz Yisrael began to decrease in its greatness, in its splendor, and Bavel began to increase, and eventually the scales tipped the other way.
So
that I believe is the real. That I believe is the real reason why there was a general accept, and this process took many centuries.
Okay, so if I'm to understand what you're saying, is that as a general rule, you don't necessarily accept the primacy of the Talmud Bavli over the Talmud Yerushalmi. Would you say that's correct?
I accept the statement of the Rambam that from the Mishnah and both Talmudim and the Tosefta and the Mechilta and the Sifra and the Sifra, etc., from all those sources we can and must study, and we are able to define and reach a conclusion, and halachic conclusion. That is what the Rambam writes, and that's what I believe in. This is exactly what the Gra did, particularly in the latter half of his life. You see in the Gra, in Shnot Eliyahu, in other works from the latter part of his life, usually written by his students, but in his name, you see that he, without even mentioning the Bavli, he explains the Mishnah according to Yerushalmi only.
So I'm taking that as a yes. As a general rule, you are not necessarily accepting the primacy of the Talmud Bavli over the Yerushalmi.
Neither did the Rambam.
Okay, fine.
Neither did the Baalei Tosafot.
Okay, that's fine. Beit Shammai and Beit Hillel. Are you working with a consensus of we are accepting the halacha of Beis Hillel over Beit Shammai?
Yes.
Okay, why there? Let's say, for example, going back to the model in the Rambam, if a Talmud Chacham sees that Beit Shammai's position seems to be more emes than Beis Hillel's position, why are we limited by that?
I am not suggesting that I can put myself in the place of all the Chachamim who existed in Eretz Yisrael at that time, when the schools of Beth Shammai and Beth Hillel existed. And over time, this also took a long time, it was also a long process. But over time, it became the general consensus of the overwhelming majority of Chachmei Eretz Yisrael that the halacha should be like Beth Hillel. I'm not suggesting that I have the authority, or I would even think of trying to overturn such a consensus.
Okay, so why are we doing it with the Talmud Bavli?
Because it's not the same thing. Because if you have a sugya in the Talmud Yerushalmi, in many instances you're talking about people who had